essay is The Meaning of the Temple. It was originally delivered at Aspen Grove, Utah, the 1st of September, 1973, and later expanded and published in Temple and Cosmos, Volume 12 of the collected works of Hugh Nibley. The Meaning of the Temple. Recently, in our family night, I was supposed to talk about the meaning of the temple in light of the gospel. One of the many distinguishing features of our time is the availability of really good popular science summaries written by top men in various fields, and none of us should neglect these, no matter what our own fields are. Any field of serious study today is necessarily highly specialized, and at the same time it calls for branching out into related fields. These summaries go far beyond the popularizing of another day. Because of our marvelous processes of photographic reproduction, magnificently illustrated books on every branch of science are now available. For example, recently I looked at P.T. Matthews' The Nuclear Apple, and before that, it was the biologist Lyle Watson's book, Supernature, and before that, Nigel Calder's broad survey of recent studies of the brain called The Mind of Man. That same Nigel Calder, who worked for the British Broadcasting Corporation, goes all around the world getting up television programs of very high caliber. Thus, while surveying recent astronomical developments, he consulted with major astronomers in every part of the world, and so built up the programs. The last one was called The Violent Universe. It was required reading in our honors program, and probably still is. And he recently has put out one on the new geology, plate tectonics, which he calls The Restless Earth. The data of these books is significant. The Violent Universe, Restless Earth, and Supernature, that is not the way I heard it when I went to school. In my day, everything was pretty well under control. At best, we had a tolerant scientific smile for anything suggesting catastrophism or any dramatic or spectacular event in history or in nature. This kind of stuff smacked of the apocalyptic visions of Mormonism, things classed in the lunatic fringe, apocalyptic sensationalism. There was no place in modern thinking for that sort of thing, yet in all these books, regardless of the fields, authors today seem to be saying much the same thing. They all come to one very interesting conclusion, which a few quotations will make clear. First, one basic proposition receives particular attention in all of them, the well-known second law of thermodynamics. Everything runs down. And it is stated with strong and bemused reservations because there is something wrong with it. Let us quote Watson, the biologist, and I understand he has a great reputation in England. Left to itself, everything tends to become more and more disorderly, until the final and natural state of things is a completely random distribution of matter. Any kind of order is unnatural and happens only by chance encounters. These events are statistically unlikely, and the further combination of molecules into anything as highly organized as a living organism is wildly improbable. Life is a rare and unreasonable thing. He belabors the point. Life occurs by chance, and the probability of its occurring and continuing is infinitesimal. There is no chance of us being here at all. Furthermore, the cosmos itself is patternless, being a jumble of random and disordered events. It is not just life that is improbable, but the fabric of life itself, matter. The nuclear physicist P.T. Matthews asks, why is the proton stable, since this is clearly crucial to the world as we know it? From the atomic point of view, the proton is one of the basic building blocks. Yet from the behavior of the other hadrons, there is no obvious reason why it should not disintegrate into, say, a positive pion and neutrino, which is not forbidden by any conservation law. The only two stable hadrons are the neutron and the proton. The neutron has a mean lifespan of 3 × 10⁻³ seconds, about 50 minutes. All other hadrons have mean lifespans of from 10⁻⁸ to 10⁻18 seconds. Matthews goes on to explain the factors that determine the stability of the proton. The rate of decay of any particle depends partly on the strength of the interaction and partly on the amount of room it has into which it can decay. To describe what he means by amount of room, Matthews draws an analogy of a room full of objects. For every object in the room, there are, of course, vastly many more positions in which it would be considered out of place. When these possibilities for all the objects in the room are multiplied together, the number of untidy or disordered states exceeds the ordered ones by some enormous factor. Then he moves into the domain of the second law of thermodynamics and a mathematical description of this concept. Matthews continues, "The logarithm of the number of different states in which a system can be found is called the entropy. Thus, the entropy of tidy or ordered states is very much less than that of untidy or disordered ones." To give us an idea about the magnitudes of the numbers we are dealing with, he presents the analogy of a deck of cards. The rate at which numbers build up in the second law situation can be illustrated by considering a pack of playing cards. We can define an ordered or tidy state to be one in which the cards are arranged by value in successive suits. There are just 24 such configurations which arise from the different possible orderings of suits. This is itself a surprisingly large number, but the number of different ways the 52 cards can be arranged is about 10,000 million, 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 or 10 to the 52nd. The chance of finding a shuffled pack in an ordered state is a ratio of these two numbers, 24 by 10 to the 52nd. Matthews continues, "The relevance of this to our problem is that one may think of a proton at rest as a very highly ordered condition of a certain amount of energy, the rest energy of the proton, which can exist in just one state, strictly two if we allow for two possible orientations of the proton spin. If the proton can decay by any mechanism into two or more lighter particles, these serve to define an alternative condition of the system which is relatively highly disordered, since it can exist with all conceivable orientations. The number of allowed states depends on the relative momentum of the decay products, much as the number of points on the circumference of a circle depends on its radius. The decay interaction is the shuffling agent. If it exists and operates on a timescale comparable with the age of the universe, then by relentless operation of the second law, essentially every proton would by now have decayed into lighter particles. Clearly the opposite is the case, and there must be some very exact law which is preventing this from happening. Had all the protons decayed, there would be no stable atoms, no elements, no compounds, no earth, no life. When the biologist said that life was wildly improbable, a rare unreasonable event, who would have guessed how improbable it really was? A human being, writes Matthews, is at very best an assembly of chemicals constructed and maintained in a state of fantastically complicated organization of quite unimaginable improbability. So improbable that you can't even imagine it. So wildly improbable that even to mention it is ridiculous. So we have no business being here. That is not the natural order of things. In fact, he says that the sorting process, the creation of order out of chaos, against the natural flow of physical events, is something which is essential to life. So the physical scientists and the naturalists agree that if nature has anything to say about it, we wouldn't be here. This is the paradox of which Professor Wald of Harvard says, the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. In this colloquial, practical sense, I concede the spontaneous origin of life to be impossible. The chances of our being here are not even to be thought of, yet here we are. So, as I say, in my school days it was fashionable to brush aside Paley's watch argument with a snort of impatience. If you're walking on the beach and find a beautifully made Swiss watch, you should not with Archdeacon Paley conclude that some intelligent mind has produced the watch. It proves nothing of the sort. Finding the watch only proves, quite seriously, that mere chance at work, if given enough time, can indeed produce a fine Swiss watch or anything else. Indeed, when you come right down to it, the fact that Swiss watches exist in a world created and governed entirely by chance proves that blind chance can produce watches. There is no escaping this circular argument, and some people use it. Today, Professor Matthews states the same problem more simply. If, after seeing a room in chaos, it is subsequently found in good order, the sensible inference is not that time is running backwards, but that some intelligent person has been in to tidy it up. If you find the letters of the alphabet ordered on a piece of paper to form a beautiful sonnet, you do not deduce that teams of monkeys have been kept for millions of years strumming on typewriters, but rather that Shakespeare has passed this way. But to Professor Huxley or Professor Simpson, this is sheer heresy or folly. It was the evolutionist who seriously put forth the claim that an ape strumming on a typewriter for a long enough time could produce, by mere blind chance, all the books in the British Museum. But did any religionist ever express such boundless faith? I don't know any religious person who ever had greater faith than that. Yet serious minds actually believe such an impossibility. They say it is impossible, but then it happens. Remember, the decay interaction is the shuffling agent, and by the relentless operation of the second law, essentially every proton would by now have decayed into lighter particles. Clearly the opposite is the case. Now there must be some very exact law which is preventing this from happening. Kammerer's new law of seriality is in direct opposition to the second law. There is a force that tends towards symmetry and coherence by bringing like and like together. That is a very interesting point. We say that light cleaves unto light, etc. What is that force? Nobody knows. They say it is there because you see it working. Buckminster Fuller calls it syntropy. The greatest Soviet astrophysicist today, the Soviets' foremost man in that field, Nikolai Kozyrev, has been working for years on this question. He claims that the second law of thermodynamics is all right, but it doesn't work. Something works against it, something stronger. He says, some processes unobserved by mechanics and preventing the death of the world are at work everywhere, maintaining the variety of life. These processes must be similar to biological processes maintaining organic life. Therefore, they may be called vital processes, and the life of cosmic bodies or other physical systems can be referred to as vital processes in this sense. We are beginning to realize with the Egyptians and the Jews that when we speak of everything, we must consider what we are not aware of, along with what we are aware of. We recognize in that principle the overwhelming rate of quantity. What we are not aware of is part of the calculation which must be used, but we've never used it before. We've just heard that anything you haven't experienced doesn't exist. Gertrude doesn't see the ghost of the king standing there. Hamlet does, yet she says she sees nothing at all, yet all that is I see. Granted, she doesn't see anything, but she has no right to add, but all that is I see. If I don't see it, it is not there, because I see everything that is there. How does one know if someone else is seeing something else? The Egyptian word for everything is everything I know and everything I don't know. Everything we are aware of and everything we are not aware of makes up everything. So you can't say everything, just everything I happen to know. Calder says in The Restless Earth, for all who inhabit this planet, the earth sciences now supply a new enlightenment, tantamount to a rediscovery of the earth. And this new knowledge has all come forth since the mid-1960s, as a result of which suddenly geology makes sense. Then what did geology make all these other years I have been at the BYU? The mid-1960s is not so far away. Calder says it is like the discovery of a new world, something completely different. And finally, we are told by the brain specialists that in our own time, the first attempts at using computers for the translation of foreign language texts have been an expensive failure. Noam Chomsky played an important part in stopping the computer people and their patrons from wasting more effort on this hopeless task. I used to share an office with a professor who had worked on a Russian translating machine way back in the 1940s. He took over the project at Georgetown University, where he worked at it for 30 years and then gave it up. It just wouldn't go. Yet they were all enthusiastic. There is no problem we cannot solve. The computer is going to solve everything for us. This hope has now gone down the drain. We are now assured that it is only a working assumption that the mind and the brain are inseparable. Ralph Sperry, who has been doing a lot with this, says, "The brain transcends the properties of its cells. There is something up and above and beyond the brain, and this is what is having a very important influence today. And now the chaos factor makes our uncertainty certain." The nuclear physicists, speaking on the same subject, say, between the electrical signals coming through the eye to the brain and our reaction to a tree in blossom on a fresh spring day, there is a vast gap which physics shows no signs of ever being able to bridge. It may even be that whatever it is that is peculiar to life and particular to thought lies outside the scope of physical concepts. I was also surprised to learn that in the field of the relationship of the particles within the nucleus, nuclear physics, no problem is exactly soluble. With the present mathematical techniques, we have no idea of how to cope with this problem. In mathematics, there is no sign that we will ever be able to solve many of these problems. We just do it by approximations. That is, as near as we can get to solving them. Two things stand out in all this. First is the awareness of an organizing, ordering force in the universe that is very active and runs counter to all we know of the laws of science. The second is the awareness of great gaps in our knowledge that may account for our failure to discover the source of that force. This takes us directly to the subject of the temple, though you would never have guessed this from what I have said so far. We talk a lot about the second law, but what about the first law, the law about the conservation of energy, which is the conservation of mass and matter in all their forms? It is important too. With that law, the Latter-day Saints have never had any quarrel. We have always believed it. By contrast, the Christian world has its doctrine of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. Recently, David Winston and Jonathan Goldstein, writing on Jewish Hellenistic thought, have shown at great length that the idea of creation out of nothing was totally unknown to the Christian or the Jewish doctors before the 4th century A.D. It had no place in their doctrines. It was always taught in the early church, as the Jews teach yet, that the world was organized out of matter that was already there. This Mormon teaching was greatly offensive to the standard Christian doctrine that God created the world out of nothing. We Latter-day Saints don't quarrel with the first law of conservation of energy. Surprisingly, we also accept the second law. In the course of nature, that law takes its relentless course. Jacob says, "This corruption could not put on incorruption." There is no chance of it. As he put it, corruption is a one-way process that is irreversible. This corruption could not put on incorruption. Wherefore the first judgment which came upon man must needs have remained to endless duration. It could not be reversed. Incorruption can put on corruption. Something can decay and break down, particles breaking down into smaller and lighter particles, but you can never reverse the process. Nevertheless, something is making it reverse. This is what the scientists talk about. It is baffling everybody. In fact, Henry Eyring at the University of Utah talked about it years ago. The theory is that the universe is exploding because it was wound up tight. But what wound it up? You have to start out with that. This corruption could not put on incorruption, wherefore this death and decay which came upon man must needs have remained to an endless duration. And notice how he rubs it in. If so, this flesh must have laid down to rot and to crumble, that is, to disintegrate into Mother Earth, to rise no more. That is the second law of nature, but according to Jacob, It is the first to which nature is subjected, the inexorable and irreversible trend toward corruption and disintegration. It can't be reversed. It rises no more, crumbles, rots, and remains that way endlessly for an endless duration. This would spell an end to everything, were it not that another force works against it. Wherefore it must needs be an infinite atonement. He says, in effect, a principle of unlimited application. An infinite principle is at work here. It should be infinite. Jacob insists on that. It can't be limited. It can't be provisional. It can't be a mere expediency. It is an infinite principle, just as much as the other principle is. Without an infinite atonement, this corruption could not put on incorruption. We could not save ourselves from entropy. Someone else must be there to do it. Notice what atonement means. Reversal of the degradative process, a returning to its former state, being integrated or united again, at one. What results when particles break down? They separate. Decay is always from heavier to lighter particles, but atonement brings particles back together again. Bringing anything back to its original state is at one meant. According to the law of nature, those are Jacob's words, according to the first principle, that could never happen. We noted that both the physicist and the biologist were aware of an ordering and organizing agent that opposes the second law. Matthews pays tribute to the Pythagoreans. Why is it then that when we come to examine the inanimate world, we find it controlled by laws which can only be put in mathematical terms? For that matter, what do I know about it? Yet all inanimate nature conducts itself according to mathematical principles conceived of as pure theory by the human mind. Somebody must be working things out, and so we begin with the creation story. There is matter. That is the first law. Matter was always there. There is unorganized matter, or as Lyle Watson says, the normal state of matter is chaos. It always is, and it always will be. The normal state of matter is to be unorganized. There is unorganized matter. Let us go down and organize it into a world. That mysterious somebody is at work, bringing order from chaos. It would be easy to say we were making up a story if we didn't have a world to prove it. Somebody went down and organized it. Matter was always there, always in its normal state of chaos. And long ago the protons should have all broken down. Yet here is the world. Matter is unorganized. The temple represents that organizing principle in the universe which brings all things together. It is the school where we learn about these things. Why did the Egyptians build temples? Recently, Philippe Deschamps has rediscovered a very important Egyptian temple document. The Salt Papyrus 825, though known for 100 years, no one realized what it was until he discovered it again. He begins by noting that the Egyptians felt themselves surrounded by an omnipresent and ever-threatening chaos. They were intensely conscious of the second law of breaking down. It haunted them. They were hypnotized, almost paralyzed, by the terror of that breaking down. And of course you will find in no place more dramatic and uncompromising descriptions of the processes of decay and the evil of death than in the Egyptian funerary texts. They hated death, they loathed it, but they looked it in the eye anyway. Order and security are the exception in this world. It would seem the Egyptians entered the land in a time of great world upheavals. Their own accounts are full of it. They always talked about it. They had seen nature on the rampage, and they knew man hangs by the skin of his teeth. Scientists now tell us about the great Permo-Triassic catastrophe. The great German biologist Otto H. Schindewolf calls the movement neo-catastrophism, and it is indeed a different picture. How un-Victorian it is to give to books titles like The Violent Universe or The Restless Earth. The earth is stability itself, as lasting and unshaken as the hills. If you but look at the daily paper, you realize that that is not the case at all. It was the same in Babylonia. We read in the Abraham traditions that the proto-temple of Babylonia, the Tower of Babel, was built as a place in which to accumulate data and master the knowledge necessary to counteract, to meet, to check, to soften any major world catastrophe. The Babylonians were scared to death. They had vivid memories of the flood and desperately determined to avoid involvement in another debacle. They thought that technical know-how could save them. The Egyptians believed that by the mind alone, chaos is kept at a distance. This implies that the cessation of thought would ipso facto mark the end of the universe. This was the great fear of the Egyptians. The most constant preoccupation of endlessly repeated rites was to achieve unlimited, everlasting stability. It was not the earthly temple which one could pretend to be built for eternity. Eternity was static time, hierophantic time, which could be attained only by constant effort of the mind. You have to work at it all the time. It was by the operation of the Spirit alone that things could be effectively preserved from annihilation. I am reminded here of the marvelous book of 4th Nephi, which describes the model society and how it disintegrated. And you retort, "My land, they lived in a happy time, didn't they?" And of course, happy are the people whose annals are blank. Nephi doesn't tell us anything about it, because there was nothing to report. It wasn't catastrophic. There were no crimes, no wars. But why did they lose it all? Because it was too strenuous. It required great mental exertion. They spent their time constantly in meetings and prayer and fasting, in concentrating on things. The exercise of the mind was simply too exhausting. It was less wearying just to give up and let things drift, to go back to the old ways. They had to work hard to preserve that marvelous order of things. Between the forces that create and the forces that destroy, the Egyptian saw himself as a third force, in between the other two. His business was to conserve, to preserve, to keep things as much as possible as they were. There is a force that creates and a force that destroys. Humans are in between. But he could conserve only by thought actualized by symbolic words or gestures. Along with this urgency went a feeling of total responsibility, which in return called for action. The basic rite of the temple was sacrifice. The point that interests us here is just how the Egyptians thought they could contribute to upholding the physical world order by purely symbolic indications of thought. It was thought that really counted, after all, yet the symbols are important. They direct, concentrate, discipline, and inform the thought. To be effective, thought must be so motivated and directed. Watson's Supernature has a great deal to say on this subject. The one thing that all the experimenters in psychokinesis, telepathy, and ESP, and all the borderline probings into the workings of the mind, which in our day are being undertaken with such astonishing results by the most skeptical people on earth, mostly Soviets, agree on is that whenever the task is set, successful performance is directly related to the power of concentration, to the will, to the desire, to total interest and involvement. The person has to be excited. Then he can do amazing things. But if the interest and concentration are not kept at a high level, nothing much goes on. When the level is high, the mind actually has a direct effect on things. The mind can do astonishing things just by thought. It is a matter of concentrating and ordering it. This principle is illustrated in the ancient prayer circle in the temples. Concentration of thoughts in a single structure has a definite significance. Much could be said about this. For the Egyptians and the Babylonians, as for us, the temple represents the principle of ordering the universe. It is the hierocentric point around which all things are organized. It is the omphalos, or navel, around which the earth was organized. The temple is a scale model of the universe, boxed to the compass, a very important feature of every town in our contemporary civilization, as in the ancient world. Years ago, Sir James George Fraser noticed a definite pattern among ancient religious cult practices. They all followed the same patterns throughout the whole world. He explained that as representing certain stages of evolution in which the mind naturally expressed itself in those forms. But since then, the gaps between these various cultures have been filled in to show that civilization was far more connected. Civilization is hierocentric, centered around the holy point of the temple. The temple was certainly the center of things in Babylonia, in Egypt, in Greece, wherever you go. This was certainly so in Pioneer, Utah. This pattern descended, of course, from ancient times to the Latter-day Saint Church. The pioneer saints throughout the half-explored wastes of Deseret oriented their streets with reference to the temple. The street is designated first, second, third, east, west, north, or south, depending on its orientation to the temple. The temple is boxed to the compass. On the west end of the Salt Lake Temple, you see the Big Dipper represented, a very important feature. Like the Egyptian temple at Dendera, you have to have the Big Dipper there, representing the North Star, around which all things pivot. The main gate must face east. The sun, the moon, and the stars, the 3 degrees, are represented there. It is a scale model of the universe for teaching purposes and for the purpose of taking our bearings on the universe and in the eternities, both in time and in space. And of course, as far as time is concerned, we take our center there. We are in the middle world, working for those who have been before and who will come after. We are, so to speak, transferring our ancestors, we have their records, all quite recent, and let us remember that the genealogy records were kept in the basement of the Salt Lake Temple, where they belong, in the sense that the work for people who lived long ago makes it possible for them to project their existences into what is to come in the future. We stand in the middle position. This earth is the Old English Middle Earth. The term in Babylonian means the knot that ties heaven to earth, the knot that ties all horizontal distances together, and all up and down, the meeting point of the heavens and the earth. It is the middle point at which the worlds above and the worlds below join. This scale model of the universe is the temple. Of course, the word for temple in Latin, templum, means the same thing as template, a plan marked out on the ground by the augur's staff, to help him determine the exact direction of the prophetic flight of birds. He sat at the cardo, the hinge or pivot around which all things turn, where the north-south line crossed the east-west line or decumanus. The person who was going to receive divination either by the birds or by the heavens would sit in the center and take his bearings with regard to his carefully laid-out observatory. This was represented in the ancient stone circles. You find most of them to be of great antiquity. There are over 200 of them in England and in France, in the form and model of the ancient Egyptian temple.